This is The Catholic Current with Father Robert Mateig.
Hey, you know what would be a great idea? Let's denature the church. What's the selling point for that?
What Archbishop Vigano has alleged is that there are some enemies within the church who essentially want to turn the church into a kind of ecumenical, nondescript, vague religion of the New World Order, religion of the one world government.
So kind of an NGO or the chaplaincy to the UN?
Exactly.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert Mateig of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. As always, let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola, we ask that you pour forth your Holy Spirit upon us, a spirit of discernment, that we might hear your voice and obey your command. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, friends, so much is going on again, and where do we begin? One of the things that greatly concerns me, I'm going to talk about it more on Friday, is it seems to be that many institutions, including our government and our schools, seem to be targeting parents as the villains, as the enemy. We need to talk to someone who's done a deep dive in that and has been following the story closely. A returning guest is Director of Policy and Government Affairs at American Principles Project, Jon Schweppe. Welcome back to the Catholic Current.
Thank you, Father, for having me.
John, what have you've been following these headlines even more closely than I have? What have you been seeing?
Well, I think there's this national debate right now about education and whether parents should have authority to know what their kids are being taught, to have some input on what their kids are being taught in the classroom, or whether that's solely the jurisdiction of woke bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., or even, sometimes on these school boards. And so as this debate has heated up, we've seen a grassroots push across the country of parents going to these school board meetings and demanding explanations as to why some of these really not fit for children concepts are appearing in their curriculum. And we're talking not just about we've heard a lot about critical race theory, about how kids are being taught to judge people based on the color of their skin, and that some people are oppressors and some people are naturally oppressed. But it actually goes beyond that. I mean, we're even talking about concepts like gender identity being taught to kindergartners, telling them that they can change their gender. And of course, on that front, it's actually extremely scary because we know that this is a psychological thing, and there's, rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is a social contagion. So, it's a really scary time for parents in this country. Can you trust public schools with your kids? And I think this is a grassroots movement we're seeing, and the left recognizes the threat it poses, so they're trying to quash it by any means possible.
What I found really tremendously edifying was not only the passion, but the sincerity and the eloquence of a lot of parents addressing the school boards. Now, granted, maybe the video I've seen is only selective, but there were two general trends I noticed. One was the parents were profoundly concerned and also very often very surprised. We need to address the surprise later. But also the kind of indignation of the school board members, that kind of imperious, how dare you? Where do you think that comes from? I mean, weren't the parents just being parents? And isn't something very wrong if elected people and bureaucrats who get paid by parents get indignant when parents act like parents?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what we're seeing is runaway progressivism. There hasn't really been a sincere fight against it for a very long time. So progressives have naturally grown accustomed to the idea that they should direct the way your kids are educated, that they should have sole responsibility, that parents, your job is to go to work and let them raise their kids and raise them how they see fit. And, this pushback is coming, you mentioned it, some of these videos are incredible, but it's coming from a very diverse group of people. It's coming from a lot of people who are apolitical, who, are just trying to work, multiple jobs, and then they come home to do homework with their kids, and they're finding some of these, terrible books that are being given to them, terrible lesson planning, that sort of thing. And so it's a really authentic movement. One of the things, I obviously work in American Principles Project. We're in the conservative movement. Like we're, pushing for parents to challenge these school boards. But I'll tell you, this is a movement that we didn't start. This is something that really came from just a natural energy. And I think it's going to really have an impact because we're seeing it across the country. Yes, there are some school boards that are defiant. I'm in Loudoun County, Virginia. That school board in particular is incredibly defiant, and they are going to be under a lot of electoral pressure because of that. But we're seeing at other school boards across the country, school boards relenting because parents are insisting. And I think that's good. Parents should have an impact on what's being taught. They should get some say. And so we just need parents across the country to continue to do that and to continue to make their voice heard.
Friends, I'm speaking about parents being vilified as they intervene in the education of their children. My guest today is Jon Schweppe. He's Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the American Principles Project. Speaking as a Catholic priest, the church has always taught that the primary educators of children are parents, and that, of course, starts even before school. One of the reasons why I admire my sister and her wonderful husband so much is that the home is the locus of education to such a degree. Everything is turned into a teachable moment that the school that the girls go to is really just kind of a supplement to what's being done at home. And when I was growing up, my parents in good faith, blue collar family, you drop your kids off at the public school and you expected them to come out learning how to read and write and be patriotic and have good manners. Whether or not that faith was justified or not is another question. But that I think that kind of naive trust that my parents had 50 years ago is not merited today. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of folks aren't quite aware of how radical the left has gotten and how deeply rooted in every aspect of society they've become. And so these are folks who, you might have heard with the Black Lives Matter founders. They were talking about one of their key goals being to disrupt the nuclear family structure. And, that sounds crazy, right? Like that is something that you can only think of on a college campus. But unfortunately, those woke college campuses, all the people who graduated from there are now elites in our society, running everything from, big business to the military. And so we really do have a problem here. And I think that's where, as you mentioned, like the family is the locus. It's the most important institution in society. It's really the institution that prevents government from becoming authoritarian and totalitarian. And once they disrupt that, once they take that away from us, there's no going back. So I think it's really important that we continue to assert this fundamentally that, parents have a right to have say over what their kids are learning in schools. And I'll tell you, something that's really encouraging is here in Virginia, there's a governor's race. And the Democrat came out and basically said that, no, he doesn't think parents should be telling teachers what they can teach. And the Republican, seized on that issue and has made it the focal point of his campaign, Glenn Youngkin, in these closing weeks as we get to the election. So I think people understand, like, this is essential to what America is. The family is everything. And if we don't defend that, nothing can be saved.
Right. I agree. I mean, the battleground is for the family. Again, speaking as a Catholic priest, Our Lady of Fatima said to Sister Lucia that the final battleground will be for marriage and family. And I think that's very, very clear, and we can't afford to have any illusions about that. Since the time of the COVID interruption, when kids have been learning online, and some teachers and board members have been saying the quiet part out loud, like, oh my goodness, what if parents know what I'm teaching their kids? What kind of lessons do you hope parents have learned in the past year and a half?
I think they it's kind of the trust but verify. A lot of parents have good relationships with their teachers. We're certainly not trying to disrupt that, but unfortunately there are some teachers who are absolutely motivated by ideology, and they really do want to get to your kids. And certainly school boards and politicians who feel that way. But I think that's where we're at. If you're a parent and your kid comes home with a lesson plan that seems, frankly, pretty anti-American or racist or kind of bizarre sexually, I think you have an obligation there to not only to tell your kid what's truth and what's not, but to confront the teacher and to confront the school district and say, look, this is not appropriate, like not for children. If you want to teach this stuff in college, that's one thing. But children should not be subjected to the politicization. So,
right. No, I agree with you. I mean, there's something taking place other than education, that we're moving from education in skills, social as well as critical, etc., and we're moving into the direction of a kind of ideology. And that I find alarming. And when you see some of the boldness of what's taking place in the classrooms, at school boards meetings, and what especially alarms me is the imperiousness of some of the school board members. Almost as if the peasants are revolting and the peasants are revolting. Elected officials shouldn't say that to the people who voted them into office. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Jon Schweppe. He is Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the American Principles Project. We're talking here on this timely Tuesday about parents being vilified for inquiring about their children's education. In the next segment, we're going to ask, what happens if big tech doesn't like you? My guest has some very recent experience in that field. Remember, our rallying cry here at the Catholic Current is Christus Mundo, Mundus Christo, bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ. We do it because our Lord says so, for the greater glory of God, the love of our neighbor, and the salvation of our own soul. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Let's keep the conversation going. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us.
Are you ready to take on the world of flesh and the devil with just the facts? This is Jesse Romero, host of Jesus 911, heard weekdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. I'm joined each day by a variety of co-hosts like Ruben Nava, Paul Clay, Dan Schneider, and my amazing wife, Anita Romero. We tackle Catholic devotions, spiritual warfare, family life, saving America, and everything in between. Join us each weekday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific for Jesus 911. God bless you. Keep the faith.
You're listening to The Catholic Current with Father Robert Matteig from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Stay connected with the show, our guests and topics, by following the show on Twitter and Gab. Just search for The Catholic Current.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert Matteig of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My guest today is Jon Schweppe. He's Director of Policy and Government Affairs at American Principles Project. It's Timely Tuesday, so we're having a wide-ranging conversation on hot topics affecting the Church and the world. You want to stay for the whole hour, because in the last segment, it's you and me sharing timely thoughts. Jon, we've seen an example of what happens when school boards don't like parents, when school boards don't like people who are mentioning unwelcome information. What happens when big tech doesn't like you? You had some recent experience with that. Fill us in, please.
Yeah, well, look, big tech companies, whether you're talking about Facebook, whether you're talking about Twitter or Google or Amazon or Apple, all these companies, they have the same ideology we were talking about. They see the family as opposed to what they're trying to accomplish. And so it's no surprise that they censor conservatives, that they do all these things. As long as Republicans allow the law to remain as it is, that will continue to happen. But yeah, we at American Principles Project, during the 2020 election, we were censored repeatedly by Facebook. Several of our online ads were banned, were fact-checked, and then taken down because they didn't comport with what the left decided reality was, even though they were true. And now Google has temporarily suspended us. They have not given from YouTube. They haven't given us a reason. We're trying to figure that out. We're in the appeals process right now, but they totally banned our channel. And this is a method of communication. I mean, this is how we reach to a lot of our subscribers, a lot of our donors and activists. And Google just decided one morning to, turn it off.
So let's be clear for the record, Jon. Your site wasn't inciting violence, for example. It wasn't doxing anyone. It wasn't saying let's burn down their house or hit them. Was there anything like that at all?
No, we had a video on the YouTube channel that encouraged people to join the Big Family, bigfamily.app, which is our small dollar donor program, our activist program. And then there were a lot of media clips of Terry Schilling or myself appearing on Fox News, CNN, that sort of thing. And, they decided that was a problem, I guess. And it is hard for us to really understand why, because Google still has not given us a specific as of this interview. I know we've been in talks with them, but so, my hope is that they will. But in the meantime, we have to assume the worst. And, for us, we're a political group. We announced a 6-figure campaign in the Virginia governor's race last week. And so, it feels like it's pretty related to that because it just seems random otherwise. So that's kind of, we are sounding the alarm. We have Republican members of Congress and senators asking Google right now for, what the justification here is. But, our message is, look, if they can do it to us, and they've done it to us repeatedly, they've done it to others, they're going to do it to everyone on the right, anyone who stands in their way. They have way too much power, and we have to rein that in.
Jon, I'm not an attorney. I'm not a communications law specialist. But my understanding is that if you're simply a carrier, say AT&T, and you and I decide using AT&T phones to plan for a crime, that's not on AT&T at all. Whereas if you and I want to plan a crime using, say, the Washington Post as a publisher said, hey, we're not allowing that because we're held accountable for what we publish. Isn't it the case that big tech wants it both ways? That, sure, we're going to let Al-Qaeda and child pornographers have their way, but if Jon Schweppe from the American Principles Project says something we don't like, then we get to jump on them with both feet because we're really a publisher. Am I reading that correctly?
No, I think you are. I mean, part of the problem is there's federal law that immunizes them from tort, from legal liability for content on their platforms. So that law is kind of treating them as if they're common carriers, but they get the decision as to what to censor and what not to. And, I think we'd all agree we want them to censor the, child pornography, these calls to violence, that sort of thing, of course. But that's not really what they're focused on. They're ignoring a lot of that stuff so they can spend their time, making sure that American Principles Project isn't reaching their audience and making sure that Democrats can win key elections. So, I think as long as they are declaring themselves to be the arbiters of truth and getting to decide what stands and what doesn't, they should be held liable for all of it. I think that makes perfect sense.
Now, Jon, I remember that shortly after the recent unpleasantness in January 6th in Washington, D.C., some people describe it as an insurrection. I mean, it's been described in a lot of different ways. But I know that the Bank of America, for example, without being presented with a warrant, without being asked, said, hey, we're scanning all of our customers to see if anyone used their bank card in Washington, D.C., and then we're letting the FBI know, hey, those people were Washington, D.C. on January 6th. You should follow up on them. I find that astounding. I'm at pains to see how that is in harmony with the Fourth Amendment. I remember one time asking students what they knew about the Fourth Amendment, and they said it's got something to do with religion, and I said I need to do something else from now on. That having been said, there is a genuine right to privacy as well. Are we moving in the direction of the panopticon of the constant surveillance state where not only government but banking, academia, media are all partnering to surveil the people they don't like? Are we moving in that direction, or am I being an alarmist?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. You'll remember, James Madison, one of our founding fathers, father of the Constitution, warned against the Bill of Rights. He was opposed to it being included in the Constitution. His reasoning was that if we put these clear rights into the Constitution, someday people might interpret them as, the only rights. As specifically written. And so now we're actually kind of seeing that as the left has become this really kind of a blob between private institutions and public institutions. They're all acting in the same, with the same motivations, with the same effort. we're seeing a way to get around the First Amendment, to get around the Fourth Amendment. You're giving your data to these companies, right? You're, as a consumer, you're choosing to have a cell phone or a credit card. And so these companies can, collude with the state to do whatever to you. And I think that's the scary thing here. And if we don't, I think Republicans really have to consider, their relationship with these private companies when they are openly circumventing what are natural rights for people. Because this is incredibly dangerous. And, obviously with January 6th, people who did wrong should, serve the time for it. I'm not saying that, but, this is America. Like, we have a court system, we have a due process, and all of these things seem to be being thrown out the window. It is pretty scary.
Friends, I'm speaking with Jon Schweppe. He is Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the American Principles Project. It seems to me, there was a time when jurisprudence talked about simply the desire to be left alone. And that's something, I'm a natural introvert. You wouldn't know it given the kind of work I do, but I'm a natural introvert. But the prospect of being just left alone is really wildly attractive to me. And it seems to be that there is a determination not only to be bombarded with advertisement, and we want to target your advertisement, so just click these boxes right here, and we're going to follow your every move. It seems to be that there's a desire to know where you are and what you're doing at all times. I mean, there's a suggestion among the powers that be that local banks will have to support any count or attraction or transaction over $600. In Australia, there's a quote-unquote voluntary program where health officials can send you a text, and within 5 minutes, you have to respond with a selfie, which face recognition software will identify, and it'll be geotagged so they know exactly where you are. So that way you can prove that you're not too far away from your home, given the lockdown. I find that terrifying. I hope that the Australians push back against that. I wonder how many of them are regretting that they don't have a Second Amendment like the United States does. What are your concerns going forward? Do you have any? What are the steps we need to take to make sure that we don't end up like a crossover between China and Australia?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head with the Second Amendment. I mean, that is kind of our insurance here. But I'll tell you, what people need to be able to do is to take back our democracy. We have to engage. And, I think a lot of folks in 2020 were kind of exhausted by everything. They saw Joe Biden as, this overall nice guy, and it might be a return to normalcy. And I think, unfortunately, those folks didn't realize what we were up against. This is not your grandma's Democratic Party. They're very hell-bent on imposing what I would argue is a cross between 1984 and a Brave New World. The surveillance state of 1984 with the cultural, craziness of a Brave New World. And so, what we're doing here is it has to be engaging. We have this, I mentioned it, we have this Virginia governor's race. Virginia is a purple state that's been trending blue. But, the number one issue out here right now is, should parents have authority over what their kids are learning in schools? And if Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, wins, that's sending a pretty loud message nationally for the midterms. So I think, politics is one of the few institutions that conservatives have a voice in anymore. We've lost almost all of them. And I think we have to commit to that. We have to commit to taking back power. And then, Republican politicians, common sense politicians, they have to start being willing to use that to protect people, because that's really the purpose of government. It's to protect the natural rights of our citizens. And that includes from private actors, from corporations, from whomever.
Right. You see, I think there's a misplaced sense of ownership. I mean, it's supposed to be that government officials work for the people who elect them and pay for their services. And I almost have the sense that there's kind of an animal husbandry taking place, that we're simply the livestock that is periodically milked for resources, and that if we get a little bit too rambunctious, it's time to put down old Bessie because she doesn't give milk like she used to. And yes, that does sound kind of Animal Farm. It does seem to be an exaggeration. But when I look at what's taking place around the world, and friends, watch the videos of Australian police throwing grandmothers to the ground and pepper spraying them because they're carrying signs expressing concern about how COVID is being treated in Australia. How much are you willing to bet that cannot happen in the United States? Are you ready to take that bet? I'm not so sure. Friends, we come back. We're going to continue our conversation with Jon Schweppe, he's Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the American Principles Project. You're joining us on Timely Tuesday, where we have an open-ended conversation about hot headlines affecting the church and the world. In the next segment, I'm going to ask our guests, is it too late for America? What do you think? After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Wherever you can find audio, you can find us, but just don't download it and spread it around. Follow us on your favorite channel, write a 5-star review. We need to attract the attention of the algorithms so that these conversations can get the attention they deserve. Together, we can take this conversation around the world. We certainly cannot do it without you. Let's get busy. We're back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us.
This is The Catholic Current from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Catch up on an episode you've missed or share them with your family or friends. The Catholic Current is podcasted wherever you enjoy listening. Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTeigue of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. It's Timely Tuesdays. It means a lively guest and I have an open-ended conversation about hot headlines affecting the church and the world. You want to stay with us for the whole hour, because in the last segment, it's just you and me sharing timely thoughts, reflecting on what we heard today. My returning guest is Jon Schweppe, he's Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the American Principles Project. Jon, given some of the challenging things that we've talked about, I've heard a variety of responses. I'm going to lay it out for you and then ask what your take on it. One is, well, it's over. It was fun while it lasted. Let's just spend the time pleasantly and wait for the sweet meteor of death to hit the planet. There are some people who say, hey, let's learn from Christians in the past. Let's build arks. Let's dig catacombs. Let's secede in place. There's a third element that says, well, we'll just build a parallel society. For example, rather than being on Twitter, we'll just follow Andrew Torba and his good work on Gab, for example. And then the fourth view that says, look, a market solution alone is not enough, because if we don't have our hands on the levers of power, they are. What's your take? What do we give up? Do we head for the hills? Do we make an ennoble ride forward and die with our boots on? What do you suggest?
Well, I think there's reason to prepare for all of those options. Rod Dreher wrote the Benedict option several years ago, and I think it was pretty prescient in terms of understanding. But, one of the things I keep coming back to whenever I am tempted to do that, and, I have 3 children. We're going to either homeschool them or send them to Catholic school. Like, we are, in a sense, doing that as well, right? But the one constant with the left, I know their ideology seems to change every few years, but there is no limiting principle. They get more and more radical all the time. We're now, openly hearing them talking about parents as domestic terrorists. So I think, it would be foolish for us to think that, that they'll just let us be. I just don't think that that's necessarily accurate.
Yeah,
so
it's not part of their business
really
model.
Do have to look at, to me, I think you do have to reclaim the levers of power and use that for good. Because the good thing about Christians, about conservatives, we are pluralists. We are, to a degree, liberals. I mean, we believe in free thought and free expression and having these debates out in the public square. They don't. And so I think, we still do have a functioning democracy to a degree. I know that these institutions are really trying to take that away from us, but I think engaging, I think that, taking back power, and then Republicans have to actually use it. That's the way we can actually save the country. If that fails, which it may, I'm pretty confident, I'm optimistic that it won't, but if it does, then yeah, I think we do have to find ways to, kind of embrace a radical federalism and move our people to red states and build red companies and, red technology and kind of take the Claremont Institute approach to this. I think that's probably the smart thing. But in the meantime, I mean, I don't think the nihilism of it's all over is helpful.
Right.
It may be. And that's ultimately, God knows, and we don't. So
right.
In the meantime, I think we have to fight for our families and fight for our communities. And something else, Father, I just want to, this has been a tough conversation. We are living in some dark times, but I do want to remind your listeners that, the American people are pretty good people. We're talking about our elites being pretty toxic, and I think they are. But, anytime you see, I come from a small town in Illinois, and, you'll see like a child gets cancer, and the whole community, Republican, Democrat, white, black, they'll all rally behind this family. That goodness, that fundamental goodness, is what the founders believed set America apart and made it where we could be a constitutional republic. And I think it's still there. So I think, one of the most important things we can do is to appeal to that goodness in our fellow citizens and try to build a populist movement that can challenge the progressive left.
I think it's important to have short-term, mid-term, and long-term plans. And I'm more inclined to think in terms of the long-term. And long-term, we have to have parents recommitting to being parents. They have to recommit to being the primary educators of their children. And speaking as someone who spent most of his adult life on college campuses, either as a student or as a professor, you could tell within minutes who grew up in a family where their parents were on the ball and invested, and which parents were just paying the bills and dialing it in and checking boxes. So that's the first thing, is we have to have a conversion. But all the conversions that we need as parents, as citizens, as voters, as educators, as professionals, whatever our walk of life is, whatever our state in life is, there has to be a primary conversion to God. I mean, there was a time when we spoke of Christendom. Geographically, what it had been the roots of Christendom is now referred to as the West. But the West, since at least the French Revolution in 1789, has decided to organize life without any reference to Christ. And as a result, we ended up not only with a lot of bad art, but with a lot of dead bodies. In the 20th century, the leading cause of death wasn't plague or war. It was democide. It was governments killing their own people. So I want to say, hey, you know that organizing life without Christ, now that we've got almost 200 years of that, more than 200 years of that under our belt, and we see what a mess we made, I think we need to try something different. What do you think the role of Christianity should be playing in the rebuild of civilization that I think is necessary?
Well, I think you're right. Diagnosing that issue, Republicans, conservatives in this country, especially, I think for a long time run away from embracing a kind of theological political identity. It's been more about, maybe evangelicals have done a better job at that, but largely, we've tried to separate the two. And you're right. I think, Christianity is compatible with a lot of these American values in ways that this secular leftist religion, which I think it is clearly not. And so, I think that's a big part of it. I know there's been talks about, integralism and the idea of, kind of pushing towards a more theological approach to government. I as you said, there's steps, right? And so I think, in the short term, we have to recognize where we're at and appeal to religious principles without maybe transparently, calling for a Catholic order in America. But I'll tell you, I think you're right. I think religion has to be a big part of this because that is a key of what separates us. And even non-attending people, even people who are fundamentally, pretty good people in society who maybe haven't, come back to the church or whatever yet, they're still being guided by Christian principles. They just maybe aren't as conscious of it.
Right. I think we have to be a lot more intentional and say, you know what? Here's an example. When people thirsting for justice were expressing their thirst rather kinetically, breaking windows and setting fires and looting, or non-traditional shopping, as I think it's called now. They had T-shirts and signs that said, "No justice, no peace." And I said, well, then we're in a world of hurt, because to depend on humans to enact perfect justice, that's a recipe for failure. That contains within it an embedded opportunity for regret. But people who know that they're sinners and loved sinners and forgiven sinners know that real justice and real peace only comes from harmony with Christ. So we need to disabuse people of the notion that the mess we're in, that the mess that we made in our lives, is something that we can fix ourselves. That we need to get rid of that illusion in a hurry. And I think Christian leaders need to step up in a big way. Friends, I'm speaking with Jon Schweppe, Director of Policy and Government Affairs of the American Principles Project, on this timely Tuesday. We're asking now, is it too late for America? Neither of us think so. You'll want to stay with us for the whole hour, because the next segment, it's you and me sharing timely thoughts. Jon, you mentioned that you mentioned an institute, and it began with a C, and I just blanked on the name. I apologize.
Claremont.
The Claremont. Fill us in. You talked about a Claremont Institute approach. Fill us in on that, please.
So I'm full disclosure, I'm a Lincoln Fellow there. I was in their program back in 2020. But Claremont is, their approach to things, first of all, they love America. They love our founding documents. But I also think they see things a little bit more clearly than maybe some of the, what we would call conservative Inc. organizations out here in Washington. And their view right now is pretty much we have to do all of the above. We have to continue to implore politicians to fight for American principles, even if that means exerting state power. But also a big part of it, I think, is a natural move towards red states, a move towards, this parallel country you described earlier, building our own technology, building our own companies, maintaining those companies, not allowing them to go woke. And, I think we're starting to see that. I mean, there's been some efforts to, create like internet infrastructure for conservatives and that sort of thing. I think, I agree with them on that. I think my big thing that I would emphasize to people is you can do both. You can prepare, for for something really rough coming, and then also try to fix it before the problem happens, preventative care or whatever. So I like their approach. I think it's something that we need to start thinking about more. But at the same time, we really do need to, it's really not over. I think federally, I think we can still take back the country and keep it America.
And start with concentric circles. Start with your family. Parents, please control who and what comes into your home. Be very exacting about your children's access to electronic devices. Be very, very involved in your children's education. Take on that role of being a primary educator. And there's so many good resources that are available to help you with that. Jon, we've got about a minute and a half left. For the listeners who are not familiar with the work of the American Principles Project, fill us in, please.
Well, we are the premier pro-family political organization in the United States. We've been growing. We engage in campaigns and elections. We work with elected officials at the state and federal level to pass legislation that protects families, protects children. And, you can see our work at AmericanPrinciplesProject.org. We're still on Twitter for now. We haven't been banned yet. AP Project. And, every day we're just trying to do as much as we can with the time we have and try to prepare for hopefully, a pretty good election cycle coming up, and hopefully a chance to get America back to where we were and hopefully do some of those things you mentioned and bring Christianity back to the country.
Well, I can't help but think, Mark Stein said, the future belongs to those who show up. And the Christian virtue of hope isn't wishful thinking. It's not, wouldn't it be nice if? It's a choice to show up, to make oneself available to a possible good future. It's to be alert to the presence of God's grace. It's to be alert to the presence of the demands of obligation and duty. And it's also a choice to be alert to opportunities for heroism, for generosity, for goodness. Christians have to live their lives in such a way that people will ask, if this be the servant, what be the master? And here at the Catholic Current on the Station of the Cross, we try to facilitate that process, making our listeners excellent disciples. Jon Schweppe, Director of Policy and Government Affairs at American Principles Project, thank you for a fascinating conversation. I look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Father. I appreciate it.
I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTigg. You want to stay with us for the rest of the hour. In the last segment, it is you and me sharing timely thoughts, reflecting on what we've heard today. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Be part of the conversation. Follow what we're following by following us on Gab. That's gab.com. Our channel is The Catholic Current. Everything you need to take this conversation to your family and friends, we give to you. Together, let's take it around the world. We can do it with you. We cannot do it without you. Friends, we're back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us.
Each weekday from 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern, the Station of the Cross brings you Mother Miriam Live.
It is Christ's church. He will build it. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. But it's time for us, the remnant, to step up and do everything we can.
Tune in from 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern for Mother Miriam Live on the Station of the Cross and our free iCatholic Radio mobile app. You can also watch the video stream every day on Facebook or on YouTube.
After today's broadcast, go to the Catholic Current show page on thestationofthecross.com for info on today's guests, the show resource links, and to sign up for our weekly email of upcoming shows.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTigg of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. It's Timely Tuesday. If you missed the first part of our show, go back to your favorite podcast platform and listen to me talk to Jon Schweppe with the American Principles Project about government targeting parents. And now it's just you and me sharing timely thoughts, reflecting on my conversation with Jon today. Jon and I agreed that the building block of civilization, and the Church has always taught that, is the family. And the primary goal of a marriage is to generate children, beget children, educate them, and prepare them for the happiness of heaven. And in doing so, that leads to the unity and sanctity of the couple. And it seems that a lot of folks have been invited to outsource that very important work, dropping kids off at a more and more early age so that you all can go off and do the things. And then people who know better than you, who are telling you that you really don't need to know what your children are being taught, they'll take care of business for you. And so very many times I've talked to folks where their kids come home from school, especially if they come home from college, and said, I don't recognize my kid anymore. He says things that I don't understand. He doesn't believe and do what we've always believed and done as a family. That's a tragedy, and I think it's an avoidable tragedy. So let's take a look at a big picture, and then we're going to take a look at one tactic you can begin to employ. I want to read you an interesting quote from St. Thomas Aquinas. He says this. He says, 3 things are necessary for the salvation of man: to know what he ought to believe, to know what he ought to desire, and to know what he ought to do. So says St. Thomas Aquinas. There has to be a harmony between truth and heart and action. In my book, Real Philosophy for Real People, I talk about learning how to rightly value what is rightly valuable so that you can rightly desire what is rightly desirable. And that doesn't happen by accident. There's good example, of course. There's repetition, and there is a lot of discipline and a lot of structure. And especially early on in a child's life, parents have to have very, very sharp control over what comes into your home electronically and who goes through the front door of your home. And I think one of the tragic mistakes in the last at least 50 years is we've allowed the school and the contemporaries of our school-aged children to become the primary reference point socially as well as educationally, when really the primary reference should be the family home and the life of the parents, and not so much the contemporaries, the chronological peers of your children, but letting competent adults into your home, faithful Catholics who can hold down a job, letting them come into your home so that the child says, oh, it's an ordinary thing. This is what people do. They believe and they work and they provide for their families. So that the role models that present a kind of holy ordinariness. G.K. Chesterton, I think, said that, yes, the guy who slays the dragon, the guy who flies the airplane solo across the Atlantic back when that was a big thing, that's all well and good. But the man who makes the subway run in time at 6 a.m, that's the real hero. That's the real superstar. It's the people who get things done. And I want to add now something to C.S. Lewis. So let's complement what Aquinas said about believing what you ought, desiring what you ought, and doing what you ought. Moral imagination is so very, very important. John Sr. in his 2 books, urgent books, one was called The Death of Christian Culture, which is a brilliant diagnosis. The other was called The Restoration of Christian Culture, which is a brilliant prescription. And in the end of the first book, he lists 1,000 books you should read with your children between the ages of 5 and 18. And he observed, as a professor, as I observed as a student and later as a professor, that people were waking up in the 60s and 70s, said, oh my goodness, we've let our kids become barbarians. We should have them read great books, then they'll behave themselves, they'll become civilized. And he said, no. If the moral imagination hasn't been cultivated first, then when you immerse these kids in great books without having their soul properly prepared, what you're going to end up with, he says, is a cadre of well-read skeptical dilettantes. I've seen them when I was in school, and I've seen them when I was teaching. We want to warn against them. So let's go back to C.S. Lewis. He says this: since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise you are making their destiny not brighter, but darker. So says C.S. Lewis. Well, how do you cultivate the moral imagination of your children? Well, number 1, good example. But number 2, reading with them. Heroes, sacrifice, fighting the dragon, resisting temptation. And so superheroes, knights, heroes drawn from history, and then especially the lives of the saints. People who would rather die than surrender the Eucharist. People who would rather die than renounce Christ. People who would rather die than deliberately choose a mortal sin. Our children need to know that such people actually existed, that they're praiseworthy, and that we can aspire to imitating them in our own small way, in our own small lives, and if Providence allows, with the help of God's grace, imitating them more precisely, if that's what we're called upon to do. So letting the children know that they can become heroes, more precisely, that they can become saints, and really very specifically, that they will have failed if they don't die as saints. Do we ever tell that to our children? Do we ever tell that to ourselves? Do we ever say that aloud in our prayers? I've taught young people who are concerned that on their deathbed they will have underlived their lives. That's a good meditation to undertake. But for most of them, underliving their lives means somehow not being favorably remembered by a monument or a legacy, or not having wealth to bequeath. It's variations, whoever dies with the most toys wins. And I said, whoever dies with the most toys is still dead. We underlive our lives if we do not die as saints. If we die not ready to look into the eyes of the living God, ready to receive our judgment, hoping to hear these words, well done, good and faithful servant. Now enter into the joy of your master. If we're not teaching children to live their entire lives for that one moment, which will be their only entrance into a happy eternity, a perfected eternity, then we're doing something wrong. Let's rearrange our private lives. Let's rearrange our family lives. Let's rearrange our community lives, the way that we worship, the way that we teach, ultimately, even the way that we govern ourselves and build the foundations of our salvation, so that we all can die as saints. That's the goal of Catholics, and that's what we try to help you do here at the Catholic Current and the Station of the Cross. Think on these things today. Share it with your family and friends. I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTague, your host here every day at the Catholic Current. Join us tomorrow. We're going to meet Nathan Messerian. He's Chief Operating Officer of Support After Abortion. We're going to be talking about getting healing for men after abortion. It's an important conversation. We don't talk about this topic enough. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Everything you need to take this conversation to your family and friends we give to you. Together, let's take it around the world. Through the intercession of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, may mighty God bless you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Go in peace, and please do pray for me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by thestationofthecross.com, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. Please prayerfully consider donating at thestationofthecross.com by calling 1-877-888-6279 or through our free iCatholic Radio mobile app.